Ginger Cookies by Bess Aldrich. As there is no word in the English language with which to describe adequately the boiling cauldron of George Billings' mind on this Saturday morning, it becomes necessary to use several feeble terms. He was hurt, scornful, resentful, and angry. This was not an unusual state of mind with him, for George was 12, and 12 is the age when a boy's hand is against every man and every man's hand against him. The term man being used in its generic sense, as including women, in fact, in Georgie's case, meaning mostly women. Georgie's world was full of these disturbers of the peace: Mother, Aunt Anne, Sister Margaret, and Hannah in the kitchen. As he sat now on a pile of cement blocks just back of the garage, looking wrathfully out upon a gloomy world, he reviewed these feminine autocrats in a mental roll call. Mother, she was the decent of the whole outfit, but even she was awful silly about some things. Like today, she had gone with Father in the car to Bluff City to a funeral, and she had said as she left, "Be sure and do just what Aunt Anne and Margaret and Hannah want you to," as if he was a baby. Margaret. He just wished Dick Kingsbury knew what kind of girl she really was. You bet Dick would never marry her if he knew. He'd a good notion to tell him what a smart aleck she was. Aunt Anne. At the memory of Aunt Anne and her treatment of him that morning, his wrath grew. He'd only been hunting for pins in her dresser, and her old hand glass had busted. It was just a plain old thing with a white back anyway. He'd just like to do something to Aunt Anne to pay for what she did to him. He'd seen a girl in the movies get choked. Her eyes kept getting bigger and bigger. He'd like to do that to Aunt Anne. Hannah. The wrath in him spouted afresh, geyser-like, at the thought of Hannah. Georgie and Hannah had just participated in a particularly lively row about cookies, fresh ginger cookies. It is not necessary to go into the lurid details of the argument that had taken place in the kitchen. It had ended with Georgie throwing the objects of the violent discussion onto the table and saying, "Take your old cookies. I'll never eat one of the rotten things again." Hannah's voice, stern and uncompromising, had followed him to the door with, "Georgie Billings, as sure as you're alive, you'll be sorry before night you said that sassy thing to me." Well, he wouldn't. Nothing could happen to him to make him sorry for one word. He'd say it right over if he got a chance. Next time he saw her, he'd tell that old girl a thing or two. He'd tell her she was as homely as Al Smith, who brought the coal. He'd knock her old false teeth out. His rage led him to rise and shake off the dust where all these self-righteous feminine monarchs trod, and started him down to Jim's and Bertha's. Jim was his only brother, and the proud possessor of one wife, one baby, and one bungalow. As Georgie passed down through the alley, whacking viciously at the scattered clover blossoms, a window was raised in the Billings home, and the voice of one of his self-appointed guardians called, "Georgie Billings, where are you going?" "Bertha's," he called back briefly, sourly. Bertha, too, was just starting to bake cookies. The kitchen was hot, and the baby, sitting in her cab by the window, was fussy. "Oh, Georgie, I'm just real glad you've come," Bertha greeted him. Here, indeed, was sweet welcome, balm to a sore heart. "Can you take my baby around the yard in her cab until I finish?" So Georgie and his youthful niece started up and down the walk and around the house. Tiring of the monotony, in a few moments he picked a dandelion that had seen brighter, yellower days, and held it to the baby's nose. "Want to smell it, old top?" The baby rubbed her diminutive nose in the fuzzy white ball, sneezed, and the seeds flew far and wide. He picked another and held it to her nose. To his delight, she sneezed again, and the seeds scattered. He was suddenly, deeply interested in her. She was as good as a little machine. He picked another. With charming regularity, she carried out her part of the program, but with an additional act. She puckered up and howled, long and vigorously. Like a mother hen, Bertha came tearing out from the house with, "Did he hurt the sweet lammy?" and a great deal more jargon that Georgie thought disgustingly silly. At the continued wail, that gave every evidence of going on forever, like the brook, Bertha turned to Georgie with, "I guess you'll have to go on home, Georgie. When she gets started, she cries every time she looks at the person that scared her. Old Man Smith was here working yesterday, and she cried until he left. As Georgie started around the house, she called, "I'm sorry, Georgie. You go on in the house and get some cookies and come again another day." Glad to escape, he went into the kitchen and filled his pockets with warm ginger cookies, which proved upon sampling to taste enough like Hannah's to remind him of the late unpleasantness, so that his rancor returned. He retracted his steps through the alley, and at the corner of the next street ran on to Slim Higgins. Slim was Georgie's Huckleberry Finn. Young Mr. Higgins displayed an animation that verged upon jubilation. He held in his hands a box. He removed the cover in silence that was more dramatic than words. In the box were multitudinous packages, most of which were decorated with pictures of gaudy pumpkins. A mere half-dozen unadorned packets modestly proclaimed that they were cucumbers and turnips and hailed from no less substantial a source than the United States government. One fly-specked package of larkspur and one of poppies, equally dog-eared, concluded the display. "What do you think of 'em?" Georgie's friendship with the speaker was of such familiarity that he could detect that Slim was swollen with the importance of some mysterious plan. His association, moreover, was not of that familiarity which breeds contempt, for Slim's plans were usually of an astonishing brilliancy. The conference developed that Slim was the possessor of a round-trip ticket to Westwood, which he had found at home, that he proposed to exchange it for the pleasure of being transported from Centerville to Westwood, and that he had conceived the glittering scheme of taking the seeds along and selling them in Westwood for fabulous prices. The Higgins household was not run on the same type of greased wheels as the domestic systems of the Billings home. At one time, in a past that had seen Mr. Higgins change his occupation as often as his shirt, the family had been encumbered with a collection of seeds from a store that did not flourish as Mr. Higgins had anticipated. The shiftlessness which had allowed the leftover seeds to collect in divers corners was one with the carelessness with which an unredeemed railroad ticket lay around the house. By a master stroke of the genius for which he was dear to George's heart, Slim had correlated the two and was going to Westwood that very afternoon, on number 6 and back on number 9. Westwood was 14 miles away, and there were 4 hours between trains. As Georgie listened, life seemed a very stale, monotonous thing, as flat as a punctured inner tube. I wish I could go, Slim," he said wistfully. "Well," said Slim in the snappy right-off-the-bat manner so characteristic of the merchant prince, "tell you what I'll do, Georgie. You go with me, and I'll hire you to sew. I'll pay you half when we've sold 'em." Georgie opened his mouth to say that his father and mother were not at home, and that Aunt Anne and Margaret and Hannah wouldn't let him do a doggone thing, but he didn't say it. There came a great plan to his mind, as fascinating as it was daring. It suddenly occurred to him that they thought he was at Bertha's, and Bertha thought he had gone home. As a result of this combination, he was not really anywhere. Georgie was not a bad boy. His wickedness for the most part consisted in formulating wild and wicked schemes that never materialized. Always something held him back. He did not know that it was the good angel called conscience. But now he turned his back on the good angel and informed Slim that he would probably be over to his house as soon as he had eaten dinner. Arrived at home, he waited by the alley fence until he could see Aunt Anne and Margaret sitting at the table. He was hungry, but he would have to forego dinner if he got away with Slim. So he went around to the front door, took off his shoes on the porch, and crept upstairs to his room. There he grabbed his best coat, tucked under his arm a little china pig, and dimes, and slipped downstairs again. He stayed in the empty garage a sufficient length of time to cover the dinner hour, and then went to Slim's. There he spoke carelessly of having forgotten to wash his hands and black his shoes, so Slim laid out a toilet equipment, lent him the shoe blacking, and even charitably contributed some saliva when Georgie's source of supply ran low. The china pig, upon patient shaking, disgorged from its innards the sum of 94 cents. Georgie's sense of propriety would not allow him to ask Slim for something to eat, but just as they were leaving the house, he casually wondered if they shouldn't have taken a little lunch along. It seemed to strike Slim favorably, for he ran back and came out with one pocket bulging. At the station, Georgie bought a round-trip ticket for 84 cents, which left him 10 cents for all overhead expenses. It seemed very queer to be getting on the train instead of watching it go through. Georgie's pleasure was somewhat marred by the butting in, so to speak, of the good angel which had been mentioned before, but, being firmly of the opinion that if one had already practically hanged oneself for both a lamb and a sheep, one might as well try to get what enjoyment one can out of the sensation, he had entered heartily into the experience. When they had passed Dry Run Bridge and the dairy farms, Slim took out his package. It consisted wholly of ginger cookies. That was kind of funny, thought Georgie. First Hannah's that she had howled out, and then Bertha's, and now these. Slim's were not large and golden brown like Hannah's or Bertha's. They were small and dark and hard, belonging to the species known as boughten ones. Georgie ate his, but not enthusiastically. When the long and perilous trip of 14 miles was completed, they alighted at the Westwood station and walked over to the shade made by towering piles of lumber to plan their campaign. Details of the preparation included the equal division of the packages of pumpkin and government seeds, while Slim took the poppies and Georgie the larkspur. Slim, as a business manager, gave final instructions to his salesman. Territory was divided. Prices were fixed, but not inexorably. They took opposite sides of the street and started out. The houses near the station were small and scattering. Families seemed poor. In fact, they seemed not to be able to buy pumpkin seeds. Georgie was surprised, but not alarmed. He was desperately hungry. The atmosphere was humid and terrifically hot. Sturdily, doggedly, he trudged up the blocks into every yard. He was not discouraged, for the first sale was always just ahead of him, a dancing, beckoning will-o'-the-wisp. In vain did Georgie dilate upon the merits of these particular seeds. In vain did he show the government seeds. To him the word government had a magic sound. The difference between mere seeds and government seeds was at the difference between chairs and mahogany chairs. But no one seemed impressed by the word. Some people told him that their pumpkins had all been planted long ago. Some told him nothing at all, merely glared at him and shook their heads. Some frankly laughed at him, which was, of course, the unkindest cut of all. Far ahead of him, on the opposite block, he could catch glimpses of Slim going monotonously in and out of various yards. After a while, changed circuitous route to the first of the stores in the business section. It was small and dingy, a bookstore. An old man sat in front of it with an open volume on his knee. Georgie approached and asked whether he could sell him any garden seeds. The old man closed his book and took off his glasses with the deliberate movement of the old. He was slender, clean, courtly. Upon seeing him, one would think immediately of the phrase, a gentleman of the old school. "Well, well," the old man spoke kindly, "so you're going to sell me some seeds." It was the first kind word that had been thrown to Georgie, so he felt a sudden rush of emotion toward the old gentleman. It was akin to seeing a light in the window of home after a long journey. "Yes, sir, I'd like to." "Well, well, it would have been aggravating if it had not been so kind. So you're out on a selling expedition. Then I know who you are. You are a ship laden with shimmering skills and priceless arabesques. You are a sled loaded with walrus tusks and costly furs. You are a caravan bearing golden brown figs and aromatic spices." This last was, of course, the most apt metaphor of all. George was, indeed, a caravan laden with spices, mostly ginger. But since the old man did not know it, and Georgie's sense of humor was not deep enough to recognize this joke, neither laughed. "Ah, yes, I know you then. Your name is Spirit of the Trade." Georgie, who was becoming fidgety, said, "No, sir, it's Billings." The old man smiled. "What kind of seeds have you?" Georgie nearly choked on his hasty answer. "Pumpkins and cucumbers and turnips and larkspur." "Larkspur? My, I haven't thought of larkspur for years. Once I walked in the garden with a girl whose eyes were the color of blue velvet, larkspur that grew there. She was very lovely. We were not to see each other for some time, and we were sad. And what—" He looked whimsically at Georgie. "What more sad than that do you think happened?" Somewhere, from vague, undeveloped depths of understanding, Georgie drew the answer. "I guess she died." No, she did not die. We met again years afterwards in a crowded hotel lobby. It was in Bern. And the sad thing happened. We had ceased to care. Well, well. And what is the market quotation on larkspur today? Quotation? Had just one meaning for Georgie. It was a nauseous thing to be committed for opening exercises, so he looked stupidly at his customer, who immediately said, "The price, sir." "Oh, 10 cents. The old man took from his pocket a few small coins and looked at them ruefully. "There are not many, but surely I would not begrudge one for memory. I will take the larkspur, my friend. See, I will put it here between the pages of leaves of grass. I shall not plant it. It might not grow. So many things in this world are disappointing. But all afternoon I shall dream. I shall walk in an old garden by the side of a girl who is very lovely." As Georgie hurried up the street, he looked back at the old man, and, for some reason too deep for him, a lump came in his throat. In a moment, however, he was whistling for Slim, who joined him. It seemed that Slim had not sold anything. Then Georgie displayed his dime with just a pride, and suggested their getting it changed so each might share his lawful dividend. Thereupon ensued a discussion over which one could wish to draw the veil of darkness. By an intricate process of reasoning, Slim proved that the dime was all his. "I said half when we'd sold 'em," he bellowed. "Well, we ain't sold 'em all, have we?" Disgusted but subdued, Georgie, whose stomach was craving something besides spices from the West Indies, made straight for a bake shop. With his own dime in his hand, he hung gloating so long over the array that the white-clad clerk looked at his impatience. "There," said Georgie at last, even as Bassiano may have chosen the casket, "a dime's worth." He indicated with a slightly soiled finger some delectable-looking white cakes with pink frosting. Then he turned quickly at an excited call from Slim and joined him outside of the shop. Slim had discovered what looked to be a movie house in the next block, so Georgie got his sack of cakes together and they walked down to explore. There on the billboard was the fascinating likeness of the Knight of the Mustache. "I'm going," announced Slim, with the alacrity for changing plans so characteristic of the senior Higgins. Georgie looked ruefully at the sack of cakes for which he had bartered his worldly goods. "It don't seem just fair, Slim." "Oh, I guess it's fair all right. And I got the money?" Georgie admitted that this was true, but his heart was sore within him. So Slim went into the abode of bliss, and Georgie, with his sack of little cakes and both boxes of seeds, went over to a park bench. He opened the sack and peered in. Then he started up wildly and tore the bag half open in his haste. Where were his little pink and white cakes? These were cookies, ginger cookies. Suddenly he remembered that the tray of ginger cookies had stood next to the one of white cakes. The clerk must have thought he pointed to the cookies. He rushed over to the bake shop intending to ask the man to change them, but several customers were in and his nerve failed him. So he went miserably back to the bench. Georgie did not know what retributive vengeance meant, but in a vague, boyish way, he began to feel that something spooky was following him all day, that some mysterious power was exacting satisfaction for a wrong. He and Petey Eberhart had read a story like it in the Eberhart barn. It was called The Old Man's Curse. He looked nervously around. Had Hannah cursed him? For a little while he sat quietly in the park, under the shadow of the thought. Then his eyes fell upon the seeds. If he could only surprise Slim by selling them all. So with sudden energy he rose and crossed to the other side of town, where seemed to dwell the aristocrats. Because the proletariat had not purchased seeds, it did not follow that the patricians would do likewise. For one solid, hot, perspiring hour he worked harder than he had ever done in his life. At the end of that time he turned wearily into a yard where a woman sat in a garden seat. She was old. She looked like a coiffured, manicured, bejeweled witch of Endor. When Georgie announced his errand, she said sharply, "Have you got a license?" Georgie did not have one. Moreover, he did not know what one was. But he was suddenly, intensely alarmed. "Then," she said fiercely, her permanent wave bobbing up and down on her wrinkled old forehead, "you get right out of here or I'll call the town marshal. And what's more, you try to sell government seeds in this town and I'll report you to the federal authorities." Georgie left hastily, aided in his flight by visions of President Wilson coming through the park to collar him. He dropped breathlessly down on a bench. All was lost save honor and the seeds. He did not know whether he was a communist, a socialist, an anarchist, or a Bolshevist. He only knew that he was something he had not been before. For another wretched hour, he loafed around the park and waited for Slim. Occasionally, he nibbled at a cookie, but it was not pleasant to his palate. He was glad when the show was over, glad when they got on the homebound train. Slim, full of enthusiasm over the picture, kept up a running dissertation of its merits. But Georgie was strangely silent. The old lady who sat across the aisle tried to draw him into conversation. Under ordinary circumstances, he would have told her, unbidden, who he was, his place of residence, the make of his bicycle, and his favorite color. But now he only responded with, "Yes, ma'am." "No, ma'am." She was a lady who bulged out in many places. Her cheeks, her body, her hands, all seemed to have been pneumatically blown up. The little gray-whiskered man next to the window was almost hidden by her. The two spread out their lunch. Georgie's greedy eyes fastened themselves on some huge slices of bread and butter and pieces of fried chicken. There was a leg all crisp, and the old lady caught his look, so he turned his head away quickly. "Here, little boy," she spoke in halting English. "Here is some things for you." As he turned toward her, he felt intuitively that he knew what it was going to be. Yes, it was just as he thought. They were huge and thick and ginger-colored. He was not surprised. He had reached a state of calm despair, a sort of mental ennui, as though it would not do the least good to fight against the uncanny nightmare thing. Mechanically, he put out his hand for them. He gave one of the loathsome things to Slim and squeezed the other down the crack of the plush seat. Whenever the old lady looked at him, he wiped his mouth vigorously with the back of his hand. When they were nearing Centerville, with that necessity for confession so essential to some souls, Georgie said, "Say, Slim, the folks didn't know I come." "Didn't they?" Then he added consolingly, "Gee, I'd hate to be you." Georgie half expected that Margaret or Aunt Han would be at the station to meet him. There was no representative there, however, only Alice Smith for the mail, and a dozen hangers-on. As the two walked up Main Street, they spoke wonderingly to each other of the changes in town. One would have thought there were old men returning the scenes of their boyhood. On the far edge of town they parted, Slim to go whistling cheerfully down the street, secure in the knowledge that there would be no reward and no questions asked, and Georgie to turn at the Billings driveway and saunter silently, albeit nonchalantly, toward the house. It was somewhat disconcerting to see the garage door open and the big car inside. Father and Mother were home. For a moment he paused to decide which of the entrances to the house looked less forbidding. He chose the dining room door. His entrance could have not been more dramatic, for it opened the door directly upon the family sitting at the supper table. As they turned and looked at him, it seemed that there had been 75 seated around the table. There was a vast silence. It closed in around him like water over his head. It was his father who broke the long, chilling stillness. Rare indeed were the occasions when his father took the steering wheel of the government from the mother's hand. This was evidently a rare occasion, for he said in the tones that partook of the qualities of lemon ice, "Young man, you can go up to your room." As Georgie passed the table, he caught a fleeting vision of cold sliced ham, pinkish white, of light rolls and blackberries. Lucifer might have gazed upon such a scene, and just before he was cast into outer darkness, Georgie carefully closed the door of Paradise Lost behind him, tiptoed up to his room, and seated himself quietly in a chair by the window, and waited for the great mystery. Stoically, he repeated, "Scoldin's don't hurt you, lickin's don't last long, and kill you they dasn't." For ages he sat there, while outside, in the great world, people were born, married, and passed away. He was the only person in the universe to whom nothing happened, whose functions were paralyzed, whose life was at a standstill. After a few years, he heard someone coming up the stairs. His door was opened. He did not take his eyes from a small green bush on the side lawn. The someone behind him spoke. It was his mother. "Georgie," she said quietly, "we are all surprised beyond words that you would do a thing like that. Father says to tell you to go to bed. You're not to have any supper." Her chin wobbled suspiciously, but she went steadily, Spartanly on. "But I didn't want you to go absolutely hungry to bed, so I've brought you just a bite." Georgie heard a tray being placed on his dresser. Then Mother withdrew lingeringly. At the door she paused. "Don't forget to say your prayer, dear." Georgie, who had thoughts of his own on the subject that did not in the least accord with the orthodox creed of the church of which he was a humble attendant, made no answer. He waited until he heard her going down the stairs, then turned hurriedly, avidly, to the dresser. On the tray stood one glass of water into ginger cookies. With a groan, he hauled off his shoes and clothes and put on his gown and got into bed. A few lingering rays of sun were still stretched across his prison floor. He could hear the family laughing and the tinkle of dishes in the kitchen. Cars began to go by with merry loads. Slim was whistling out in the alley. Slim, who was free. For a long time he lay looking out toward the tree-grown hill behind the pasture, reviewing the miserable afternoon. He was glad he had hidden the seeds in a bush in the Westwood Park, glad he had purposely neglected to remind Slim to bring them home. He'd hoped they'd take root and grow all over the park, thick, so thick that the Westwood folks couldn't ever walk through it, darn 'em. The moon swung slowly into view. It was large and round and yellow, golden yellow. It leered at him. It looked. The perspiration broke out on Georgie's forehead. Then he shivered a little, pulled the sheet up, and turned his face to the wall. It looked like a huge ginger cookie. This has been Ginger Cookies by Bess Aldrich. For more information, visit www.bestreaderaldrich.org.